Welcome to another episode of Sideline Sanity with me, Michele Tafoya. Hit that subscribe button if you would. Give us a rating if you want, but subscribe. We've got so much good content coming down the pike, including today. David Marcus, a writer that I really enjoy following. We've had him on once before, but today he's coming on to talk about something we all need to really pay attention to. Did you hear about the recent poll that found Americans, only about 15% of Americans have a favorable view of China? And frankly, I'm confused about who those 15% might be. Maybe they are Chinese Americans. I don't know. But China is a threat. China is playing footsie with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. China doesn't like us. China steals our intellectual properties. They have TikTok here really well embedded in our society, taking the minds of our kids off things they need to be focused on. And let's not forget a little thing called COVID, right? So as much as you may want to say, oh, that's xenophobic, oh, that's racist. No, this is reality. China is a country with very different values from ours, and they don't like us. And if we get weak in the knees here and don't straighten our spine, we could be in trouble. And that's what David Marcus writes about in this column, and he joins us next.
For nearly 3 decades, she's reported the action from the sidelines. She started very young. She's covered the NBA, NFL, Olympics, and the college football and basketball national championships. And now, during these insane times in our world, Michele Tafoya thinks we need a serious dose of sanity. This is Sideline Sanity with your host, one of the sanest people on planet Earth, Michele Tafoya.
Hey, good to see you again, David. This article in Human Events, it's so worth the read. It's fascinating, but I want to cut to one part of it that I find important. You kind of talk about the end of the Cold War and how we experience this rush or push toward globalization, but that we might be on the brink of another Cold War right now here in the West. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, at the point at which the Cold War ended, psychologically for Americans, the most important aspect of that was that there really was no other power or even really set of powers on Earth that could defeat the United States and the West, right? So we were set up as a solo superpower, brand new dynamic. And this only a decade after, people were ducking under, school desks in fear of nuclear annihilation.
I
right?
did that, yeah.
So this was a complete sea change in terms of being essentially unbeatable, right? I mean, Rocky had knocked out Drago and we were on the way to the future. We face a threat today in China that probably can beat us if we don't do what we need to do. And that's new. And we see a lot of dynamics of the Cold War coming back, including essentially a proxy war going on in Ukraine, where Russia is the ally of China and Ukraine is our ally. We see a military buildup in China. Just today, Joe Biden is announcing a new submarine deal between the UK, the United States, and Australia, which is clearly very close to China. So a lot of these things are lining up in ways that people of a certain advanced age can remember, and those who are younger probably don't.
And so the point of your article in Human Events was, were you hoping to get to some of those younger people to get them to open their eyes and see what's going on?
Yeah, a little bit, to understand that there is such a thing again as an existential threat, and to remind all of us, I mean, whether we remember it or not, that if there is a silver lining to this, it's that an existential threat brings people in a country or really any environment together unlike anything else. And I think to some degree, because we spent the better part of 25 or 30 years without an existential external threat, we invented a whole bunch of internal threats and kind of pointed our ire at each other in ways that haven't been particularly healthy in many respects.
To me, the last existential threat was 9/11. I mean, I think that's a moment in time that so many of us can remember. I I try to explain it to my kids. I remember my dad used to try to explain Pearl Harbor to me, and I was like, that was so long ago. And now it feels that way when you try to explain to young people what 9/11 was all about. And we did come together as a country, but that was very short-lived. And you're right, now we're in this internal battle of identity politics. And you've written a lot about DEI as well, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So are we so distracted by that we're not going to be able to see this? Or do you think there are enough eyes in the halls of power, if you will, to handle this?
I mean, I hope not, right? One thing that I'll say about 9/11, and I touch on 9/11 in the piece, 9/11 was certainly a wake-up call after the happy-go-lucky 90s. There's no doubt about that. But nobody thought that Al-Qaeda was going to take over the United States, right? It wasn't an existential threat. It was a threat to our lives. It was a threat it was probably an existential threat to Israel, right? Not to the United States, not to the West as we know it. And that's what I think we're sort of creeping back into. I saw polling today that put favorability of China at 15% among Americans. And apparently that was a 38-point drop in just like 5 years, right? Yeah. So this is bipartisan. This is people on the left and on the right who, for various different reasons, are coming to understand that this is a problem. And I do hope that it's going to refocus our energy a little more to the outside and a little less towards, poking at each other in what you and I think are ridiculous ways. And I don't want to demean what anybody thinks about, racism and sexuality and gender, but, compared to what China's doing, it's just not as important.
It's not, and it's not as important on a sort of a mass scale. Like, look, you be you, you do you, respect one another, et cetera, but we have this other very hostile entity with great power, and we are entangled with China in ways that make us vulnerable, not just in terms of, if there's a war, but I can remember during COVID, the sort of threats that, well, you know what, if we have to stop shipping antibiotics to the United States, that'd be really tough, but we're willing to do that. I'm not sure who authored that or who would be able to pull the trigger on that, but I don't doubt that they would do it. So in terms of opening people's eyes, what's the first thing every individual should be doing? And by the way, hang on, I got to go back to what you said. Who are the 15% that think well of China?
I mean, look, we had something like that during the Cold War. There was a small amount of Americans who thought that, the Soviet Union was sort of on the right side of this. It was probably a little smaller than 15%, but close, I think. That certainly did exist in at least by the 70s or 80s or whatever. So, I don't know who they are. But if I just say one other thing, you mentioned this sort of wokeness and DEI stuff. There is some overlap here because when you look at the NBA and when you look at Hollywood, right, the NBA will put Black Lives Matter all over the court and, just throw amazing amounts of money at it. You mentioned the Uyghurs, and boy, nobody wants to talk about that.
Nobody. LeBron will just tell us we're not well educated about the issue. Right. If we want to stand up for Hong Kong or Taiwan and their independence, yes. LeBron decides, well, we're not educated, but he's educated to the tune of billions of dollars that he's raking in with his shoes. Yes. And there's genocide and thank goodness for someone like Enes Kanter Freedom, a former NBA player. I hope he gets back in, but it's doubtful given his stance on China and the attention that he likes to bring to this. I mean, these entanglements I talked about, the NBA is one. Now Major League Baseball is getting involved in China. We have so much manufacturing done over there. And people will just look at you and go, yeah, but Michele, Dave, it'd be really expensive to do all of that elsewhere. But it'd be really expensive not to do it elsewhere. You know what I mean? It's like, how do we begin this disentanglement? Or do we? Is it better to keep our enemies closer?
No, I think we do have to begin the disentanglement. I mean, the bet that was made in the early and mid 90s was that as China entered the free marketplace, it would become liberalized, as if by osmosis, right? As if this was just a natural process. China found a way to really foil that. Now, the one thing that we did kind of know we were doing, right? And there were people at the time like Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan who were calling time out on this, was we knew throughout the last 30 years that we were hurting American manufacturing. And we just kept hearing, well, don't worry, there'll be tech jobs, there'll be solar, you'll install solar panels, or, something else will come along, right? We don't actually have to make stuff here. And that did make stuff really cheap, right? I mean, the reason that we can walk into Walmart and buy, things that 30 years ago would have been much more expensive, much more cheaply, is because of China. And I don't, are we willing to make that sacrifice? It'll be hard. It'll be hard because you won't be able to walk into Walmart and pay those kinds of prices anymore.
So it's going to take a certain kind of leadership to sell Americans, I think, on this notion that, yeah, this is a sacrifice on your part. Jeans are probably going to cost you double. T-shirts they're going to go up 50%. But, I think that patriotism in this country and this notion of saving America or protecting what we have is really fading. Maybe there's some bounce back here, but I don't know. What do you see in that way?
I'd like to see that sense of patriotism come back, because it really has been at the core of the United States for almost all of its existence. And again, I really do think it is the fact that we finally reached that point where nobody could defeat us, that allows you to be introspective in that way, right? That allows you to sort of like run yourself down and say, well, boy, maybe we aren't. And on some level, there's value to that, right? There's value to that introspection. But I think we have to wake up today and realize, when we look at what China did in terms of, unleashing this virus on the world and then being completely unwilling to be transparent about it while millions of people were dying, we have to be able to say the United States wouldn't have done that. The UK wouldn't have done that. Canada and France wouldn't have done that. And we can say, yeah, our way's better. And that's been a hard thing for Americans to say for the past 30 years. It's been hard for Americans to say, America is better. American society is better. You're not supposed to say it. You're not supposed to say the West is better. We got to get back to it.
A food shortage in America is hard to picture. I mean, imagine going into the grocery store and not being able to get the food you normally get, milk, eggs, whatever it is. But it could come. It could happen. And what do you want to do? Where do you want to be when that situation arises? Maybe it would be a good idea for you to think about a little backup plan and have a stockpile, if you will, of food in your cabinet, in your cupboard, in your pantry, in your basement that you could rely on if something really hits the fan. Well, this is why I'm going to direct you to 4patriots.com. 4patriots.com sells survival food. It's stackable. It's easy to make. You can make these meals in 20 minutes. They have breakfast, lunch, dinners. They have everything you could need, and it's hand-packed right in a family-owned facility in the USA. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com and use the code Michele, Michele, that's one L, and get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, and that includes this 3-month survival kit. You'll get their famous year-long guarantee after you order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. Now, they're called 4 Patriots because a portion of every sale is donated to charities that support veterans and their families. And we love that. Just go to 4patriots.com, use the code Michele, Michele, and get 10% off. That's the number 4, the numeral, 4patriots.com, code Michele. Start building your backup plan, your stockpile today. I have this concern that getting back to it is going to take something awful, some awful incident for people to really understand just how existential this threat of China is, particularly when you can you look at the relationships the Chinese are developing now with North Korea, with Russia, with Iran. I mean, this is horrifying to me, absolutely horrifying. And what goes through my mind, David, as I'm talking to you, are images of all these young people going, Yeah, but we're all the same human race, and we're all one world, and they're not bad, and we were slaveholders, and just this total ignorance of today and
Yeah.
the realities of today, that there is genocide in China, that there is slavery in China. And no, having people incarcerated in the United States of America for breaking a law does not make us, and those people maybe are working in prisons. That's not slavery. That's a different animal. Am I being too Pollyanna?
No, and something really horrible did happen, right? COVID happened.
Yeah, COVID happened.
And what happened when COVID happened and we started locking down and half of Americans lost their jobs and you know, hundreds of thousands of people were dying and there was misery and suicide and all this stuff. What were we told by the Democrats and the left? We were told, well, don't say it came from China or you're a racist, right? It was the first thing they were saying that in March. Stop calling it the China virus, even though we had German measles, even though this was just sort of what you're supposed to do.
I'm Spanish and we had the Spanish flu.
Sure.
I'm cool with that.
Yeah, no, but you weren't allowed to do it because, well, I mean, you were allowed to do it, but if you did it, you were called a bigot. You know, at the outlet that I was writing for at the time, we absolutely were adamant about doing it because somebody had to hold China's feet to the fire here. And unfortunately, nobody did, and they still haven't paid any price for this.
And how much do you think, David, that is a function of this president potentially, speaking of entanglements, having some entanglements with China, having some sort of relationship with China where he cannot have a spine and say to them, this is what you did, this is what we need, and you've got to cooperate here.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no question that, you know, my friends at the New York Post, like Miranda Devine and Emma Jo Morris, have pointed out an insane number of entanglements that Joe Biden and his family have with China. You know, do I think China's holding that over his head in some way? I can't know that, but it is a fact that those entanglements exist. Clearly, just based on Biden's own language, saying that, you know, he wants competition, not conflict. He doesn't view them as a foe. I mean, that's just not going to cut it anymore. I mean, this isn't Finland over here.
Yeah, it's a little bit terrifying to me, the extent. So you mentioned Miranda Devine and the other reporters who are not so-called reporters, if I may reference a recent hearing in Congress. These are reporters who are doing the work and finding the evidence, and yet they are sort of now the marginalized people in this country who are being called the tinfoil hat, you know, pseudo experts. And yet this stuff is there. It's there for us to see. Why won't people look at it?
I mean, that's a very complicated and difficult question. And it has to do with the nature of our media landscape, which is so fractured now, right? I mean, there were a lot of problems with the old system where you basically had the three major networks and a handful of prominent newspapers and very few gatekeepers who were basically able to say, this is what the news is, this is what the truth is. You know, the good old days of Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
A lot of that was a myth. Right? You weren't finding out about Kennedy's affairs. There were all kinds of things. You know what I mean?
Yes.
There were a lot. But the upside to that situation was that when something like coronavirus happened or when something like, you know, the situation with China happens, those gatekeepers were able to get everybody sort of focused in on the same thing. We don't have that anymore. Everybody goes to their own sort of preferred outlet.
Yes.
And so there is no, and look, there isn't an arbiter of truth, right? In an ideal world, I think everybody should be going to competing outlets and saying, all right, let me read it from the right, let me read it from the left and see where I think it comes in the middle. That's probably the best answer because there is no more paper of record, and I don't think there ever will be again.
Just a quick anecdote on that. I was in a green room recently and I sat down. It was a Sunday morning and 4 newspapers were set out on the coffee table: the Washington Post, the New York Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And I took a look at each front page And you would think that any major news story in America would probably be on the front page of every major newspaper. They were all different. They all considered different things. Maybe it was over here, but maybe it was the full page. It was above the fold, below the fold. And I looked at these papers and I thought, I don't know which one of these to read. And a lot of people just don't have time to read more than their paper of choice or their outlet of choice. And so they read the headlines, believe it, and go on with their day and don't know any better. And I don't remember who said an uneducated society is they're in trouble, but I feel like we're in trouble. And I don't know that there's an easy fix to that, except for maybe some new brand of leadership. And quite frankly, I'm not even sure where that's going to come from. Do you see any ray of light here? I'm depressed, David.
I'm sorry. I can have that effect on people when I talk about such things. No, and look, I'm fairly optimistic. I mean, I do. The thing that makes me optimistic about it is that I do think that people are coming to understand what you and I are talking about, right? That it's almost like a Matrix moment of, just because it's on the cover of the New York Times doesn't mean that it's true. And just because it's on the cover of the New York Post doesn't mean that it's true. And you have to watch things play out, and you have to, sort of keep your own counsel. But yeah, I think you probably hit it with education, like as long as we have schools that aren't producing students who know how to read, that's going to be a problem. I think it was last week. I think it was the week before, actually. There was an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, and they quoted an English professor at Harvard University who said that her students at Harvard struggle to read Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. And that's just because they have a different set of tools, and it was written a long time ago. I mean, in my day, we read that in like 9th grade.
So I was going to say, I read that in high school. And you had a thesaurus with you if you needed it, and you had a dictionary, and you could ask questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's bad enough. In fact, it's very bad that a student who gets into Harvard can't read that book. It's vastly worse that the professor at Harvard is making excuses for this.
Oh my gosh.
As if it's normal and the way of the future. I mean, until that changes, you could put together the greatest newspaper and network, whatever it is in the history of the world, and it's not going to matter. I mean, that's got to get fixed first.
You've written a lot about diversity, education, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Swapped my E's there for a moment, and they're not swappable E's, believe me. Diversity, equity, inclusion. We recently had an incident at Stanford Law where a judge was invited to speak. He was invited, I think, by the Federalist Society there, and got heckled. And we see someone recorded this. We see the video evidence that, they threw epithets at him like, your racism is showing. And some DEI officer stood up and berated him and lectured him for about, 10 minutes. And he stood there and took. Now, Stanford University and the dean of the law school, I think, subsequently apologized to him.
Yes.
But as far as we know, this woman is still the head of DEI at Stanford Law. And the fact is that these students would not listen to another human being in their field. That tells us an awful lot, doesn't it, David?
Of course it does. Of course it does. And the fact that any administrator in that situation would say anything other than shut up or leave.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the only acceptable answers, right? You want to have a meeting later and talk about your feelings. I mean, that's stupid, but okay. But, in that moment, it's like, be quiet and be respectful or go someplace else. I do think that there are some positive signs that DEA may be dying on the vine a little bit. There's been recent reporting that as Silicon Valley is sort of shedding jobs and stuff, that those are the first to go, right? And even at some schools and universities, they're starting to question this. And I had a piece about this over at Fox not long ago. And the question I really asked is like, what's the value here, right? And my hook for the piece was the movie Office Space, right? Where the Bobs come in to do the layoffs.
Yes.
And I said, well, if the DEI officer comes in and the Bobs look at him and say, well, what would you say you do here, right? what value do you bring for your $150,000 a year or whatever it is salary? What are we getting from you? I don't think they have very good answers to that question. I mean, are you making the place less racist? And maybe they say yes. Say, well, is the place less racist? They'd almost certainly say no.
Well, they'd have to say no in order to keep their job.
Right, exactly. So what exactly would you say you do here? And I think that more people in leadership in our corporations and hopefully in our universities are coming to understand that this is a racket and they don't actually do anything other than create more DEI jobs. That's really all they do.
And it is a racket, and it's driving up the cost of college, which is making Joe Biden want to, relieve more students of their debt, which other people don't want to pay for. I mean, it just feels like a mess, David. It feels like a freaking mess. And I just wonder, before I let you go, what you think of these recent moves by the president to sign off on the Willow Project for, mining, drilling, whatever, looking for fossil fuels, which was something he said he absolutely wasn't going to do. He's talking about potentially detaining families at the border now, even though we have this rush in El Paso recently. And a couple other moves that it looks like he's trying to sort of moderate his tone and move back toward the middle, which he had promised us from the beginning, which we have not seen an ounce of since he took office. It has been full on leftist crap, if I may say so. And and now he's sort of trying to manipulate his way back. What does this signal to you?
Well, first of all, it signals that he's almost certainly running for re-election, which I think even 3 or 4 months ago was still a bit up in the air. I think that the Biden administration, I never like to credit too much to Biden because I've never been sure how much of this stuff is actually his idea.
Right.
Unlike a Donald Trump or even a Barack Obama, quite frankly. But I think the idea here is they're going to try to tell the far left of the party, look, we banked all these wins for you, right? We got you student loan, debt relief. We got you some of these other things. So give us the benefit of the doubt, as we head into the election and we have to pivot a little back towards the middle. Now, the signal that ought to send to actual moderate Democrats and actual moderate independents is that he's doing the same thing to you. And so he'll give you the little oil pipe, the little oil drilling in Alaska right now. But rest assured, if you let that convince you to give him 4 more years, that's going to be 4 years of AOC's priorities, not yours.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. He's doing this now to buy votes, as he's done throughout. And then people go, oh, but see, look, he is moderate. No, his administration is not moderate. It's just not, folks. And so you're right. He may placate a few people with these moves, try to get them on his side. But if he wins re-election, we are right back to this destructive crap. And I just hope people open their eyes to that. And I think you're helping, David Marcus. I really do. You can find him on Twitter at BlueBoxDave. It's one of my favorite Twitter handles of all time, and we love having him as a guest. David, thank you so much.
Thanks, Michele.
Thanks for listening to Sideline Sanity. Don't forget, as always, I'll say it till I'm blue in the face, be brave and do good. Thanks for listening.